Chapter 3. Miss Maple Gets Wet.
Uh-oh.
George had not liked other human beings. It was rare for any of them to pass the meadow. Maybe a farmer now and then, or an old woman who wanted a good gossip. And when they did, George got cross. He used to put a very loud cassette in his gray tape recorder and escape into the vegetable garden, where he worked on something as dirty as possible until the visitor had gone away again. So the sheep had never seen a whole flock of humans before, and they were too surprised to panic. Later, Mopple claimed to have seen 7 people in the flock, but he was short-sighted. Zora counted 20, Miss Maple 45, and Sir Richfield lots and lots. More than he could count anyway. But Richfield had a terrible memory, particularly when he was worked up. He forgot what he had counted already, so he counted everything and everyone twice or 3 times. He counted the sheepdogs, too. Mopple stared short-sightedly and morosely at the humans. Well, they could forget the theory of the murderer returning to the scene of his crime now. They had all come back to the scene of the crime, and the murderer must surely be concealed among them. With curiosity, the sheep watched the human flock moving on. It was led by neither the strongest nor the brightest among them, but by Tom O'Malley. Then came the children, then the women, and finally the men, who were hanging back a little with their hands awkwardly thrust into their trouser pockets, while behind them again came several very old folk who could move only slowly and shakily. Tom had brought a rusty old spade with him. He rammed it into the earth at least 10 paces from where George had been lying. The people retreated, as if Tom had splashed them with cold water, and formed a circle at a respectful distance.
"It was here," shouted Tom. "Right here. The blood spattered all the way to here,"
he said, taking 2 long strides towards the dolmen.
"And right here,"
he added, with 3 strides in the other direction,
"is where I was standing myself. The moment I see it, I knew it was all up with old George. Blood everywhere, and his face all distorted. Horrible it were, with his tongue bright blue and hanging out."
None of this was true. Miss Maple thought how odd that was. It should really have been just as Tom said, blood everywhere, a look of pain frozen on George's face. But George had been there on the meadow, looking as if he'd just lain down to sleep. The human flock retreated a little further and uttered a strange breathy sound, somewhere between horror and delight. Tom went on shouting,
"But your old friend Tom didn't panic, not him. He goes straight off to the mad boar to call the police."
A grating voice interrupted him.
"You bet your life, our old friend Tom, he'll always find his way to the pub."
People laughed. Tom bent his head. The sheep up on their hill couldn't make out what he was saying anymore. Whatever remnants of order had still existed in the human flock now collapsed. Children were chasing around all over the place. Grown-ups were forming little groups, bleating the whole time. The wind blew scraps of words up to the hill. "Goblin King, Goblin King, Goblin King," the children were singing.
"Could be he left it all to the church,"
said the one red-faced farmer. "That Lily had a nervous breakdown when they found him," twittered a chubby-cheeked woman. The man standing next to her held her hand and smiled. A small man shrugged.
"He was a sinner. What do you expect?"
"And so you are a sinner too, Harry," grinned an old woman with gaps in her teeth. "The Lonely Heart Inn. Let's say no more. Your auntie can't think herself lucky to have such a good nephew." The man turned pale and indeed said no more.
"They say he was worth a fortune,"
said a man with a prominent paunch.
"Old George had debts for sure. Everyone knows that,"
said another.
A little too fond of his sheep was George.
A very young man was telling his two friends.
Know what I mean?
He gestured. The other two laughed.
A crime of passion among the sheep, eh?
Cried the thinnest of them, so loud that a couple of women turned around. All three young men laughed their unpleasant laugh again.
Must have taken him by surprise, so it must,
said a man who smelled strongly of sweat.
And old George was damn hard to surprise. This is a disaster for the tourist trade,
said another man in a high-pitched voice.
George really knew how to mess things up for us.
He was going to sell everything that I have, the sheep, the land, the whole lot, said a woman with no neck.
It was Satan himself who did it,
whispered a mousy woman to a small, fair-haired children. God have mercy on his soul, said another woman in a trembling voice. The sheep knew her. Bible-bashing Beth was George's name for her. Beth turned up regularly outside the shepherd's caravan to urge George to do something called good works. The sheep didn't know exactly what good works were, but they thought perhaps George was supposed to go and work in some other vegetable garden. But George had a garden of his own. The sheep could see why he didn't want to do as Beth said. Every time George said no, she pressed a bundle of thin pamphlets called tracts into his hand, with a view to converting his sinful soul. There was no knowing what happened to George's soul, always supposing he had one. But he was pleased to have those tracts, although he never read them aloud to the sheep. The evening after Beth brought them, George always had baked potatoes cooked over a small, flickering fire. Suddenly, the enemy raced into the middle of the flock. The ancient enemy. All you could do was run away. Until recently, there had only been a couple of the enemy with the human flock, running round the meadow, sniffing, whistled off by their masters now and then, told to lie down, trying to make for the wide open spaces. But the closer the whispering groups of humans came to the dolmen, the further afield the dogs explored. They had now formed a small pack, 3 sheepdogs and another dog. The sheepdogs' eyes were shining. The dappled pattern of their coats flickered across the meadow. They were making for the hill, keeping close to the ground. The sheep bleated in agitation. Now they'd be herded this way and that, chased apart and brought back together again, driven by sheepdogs moving like beasts of prey. No sheep can stand up to that. They weren't really frightened. They'd been herded thousands of times before, but all the old discomfort had come over them. Then they saw the way that other dog was moving, and their nervousness really did become fear. The gray wolfhound looked as if he was doing the same as the sheepdogs, crouching low before approaching, but something was wrong. He didn't bark. He didn't hesitate. For a moment, the whole flock held its breath. They were being hunted for the first time in their lives. The dog began to run. Unbridled panic broke out. The flock dashed off in all directions, carrying the startled sheepdogs away with it. Mopple ran right through the crowd of human beings and knocked Harry the sinner over. Zora took refuge on her rocky ledge. From there, she was the only sheep who could see what was really going on. The hill was empty. At its foot, close to George's place, lay 2 dark bodies, Othello and a dog. They were both just rising to their feet again. Othello attacked first. Zora had never seen a sheep go on the attack before. Othello should have run for it. The dog hesitated. It was a moment before he recognized the black figure of Othello racing up to him as his prey. Then he took off. But before they collided, he lost his nerve, braked, and swerved aside. Othello immediately changed direction, moved in a slight curve, and galloped back towards the dog again. Zora stared incredulously at the hill. It was clear to her that Othello was faster than the dog. The dog seemed to realize it too. He crouched on the ground, teeth bared, ready to leap at the ram from below. Zora quickly closed her eyes and thought about something else. That was her way of dealing with the bad moments in life. She thought of the day when she brought her first lamb into the world. She thought of the pain and the anxiety later because the lamb had been brown as earth, even after she had spent ages carefully licking the blood off his coats. Brown as earth, with a black face. Later, the brown would turn a woolly white, but Zora wasn't to know that at the time. She had wondered why she was the only sheep in the meadow not to have had a white lamb. But then the lamb had bleated, tiny and brown as he was, and he had a more beautiful voice than any of the other lambs. He had smelled good, too, and Zora knew she would defend him against the whole world, whether or not he was the brown color of the earth. She had taken him to the cliffs that very day to show him the gulls and the sea. Zora relaxed. She had had 3 lambs so far, and they were the bravest and most sure-footed sheep anyone could imagine. She hadn't brought a lamb into the world this year, and hardly any of the other ewes had had lambs either. Zora realized why she had found meditating on her rocky ledge so hard recently, and why she was further than ever from becoming a cloud sheep. She'd missed the lambs all summer. Only 2 inexperienced young ewes had produced lambs in an excited, clumsy sort of way, and George had sworn when each of those lambs appeared. And then, of course, there was the winter lamb. Zora's nostrils flared scornfully. She listened. She would have liked to hear a few young creatures bleating just now, but everything was unnervingly quiet, except for the cries of the gulls, and Zora did not take any notice of those anymore. The human beings were buzzing away in the distance, like a lot of insects. Zora heard a terrifying scream. Her eyes opened, even though she was trying hard to keep them closed. Instinctively, she looked back at the hill. A dark body lay on the ground. Feet were twitching in the air as if they wanted to go on running. She shuddered. The dog had got Othello. Only a moment later did she see that it was the wolfhound lying on the ground. There was no sign of Othello. The shaggy wolfhound was trying, unsuccessfully, to stand up. His master came along, one of the young men who had laughed in that nasty way. He was pale and poked his dog with his foot. A farmer came to lift the animal and carry it away. The humans were buzzing excitedly. None of them could explain what had happened to that fine, strong dog. When they saw the blood on his belly, some of the women screamed. Satan and Goblin King rang through the air again. Human mothers bleated till their children came back to them. The human flock went away in a hurry as suddenly as it had come. Only the spade was left. Zora sat motionless on her rocky ledge, wondering if she might have been dreaming. Yes, that must be it. The grass around her was soft as a sheep's muzzle, and herbs that no one else could pull up grew here too. Zora called them herbs of the abyss, and to her they tasted better than anything there was to eat in the meadow. The fresh sea air wafted up in cool seaweed-scented gusts, and the gulls circled below her. It was a good feeling to have those screeching white birds lower down. It was good to be alone. No one could follow her here. She saw the flock slowly calm down and begin to graze. Othello was with them. None of the sheep seemed to be taking any particular notice of him. Zora thought how little she really knew about Othello. George had sometimes brought new sheep back with him. Usually they were newly weaned lambs and were warmly accepted by the flock. As far back as Zora could remember, only 2 grown-up sheep had come from outside, Othello and Mopple the whale. Mopple had arrived 2 winters ago in George's noisy car. George transported single sheep on the back seat. That's where they had first seen him, a plump young ram staring in bewilderment out of the car window and eating George's road map. George had placed Mopple in front of them and made a little speech. Mopple was a ram from a meat breed, he said. But they weren't to worry. No one here was going under the knife. The idea was just to bring in a little fresh blood. The sheep hadn't understood and were afraid of Mopple at first, but the young ram was friendly and seemed embarrassed. When Sir Richfield challenged him to a duel, it turned out that Mopple was no danger to anyone. Richfield had never challenged Othello to a duel, and none of the sheep had ever wondered why. More surprising was the fact that Othello had never challenged Richfield. Othello seemed to respect Richfield, although the harder of hearing and more forgetful he became, the less the other sheep could understand it. None of the sheep had seen Othello arrive. He just appeared one morning. A full-grown ram with 4 dangerously curved horns. 4 horns! They had never seen a 4-horned sheep before. The ewes were impressed, and the rams were secretly envious. Zora remembered all that very well. It wasn't so long ago. George didn't introduce Othello. Instead, he sang and whistled and danced. They'd never seen him so excited. He sang in strange languages and spread some of the stinging ointment they feared on a narrow but impressive wound running right over Othello's forehead. The sheep shuddered, while Othello stood perfectly still. George jumped from one leg to the other until he had to take his woolly sweater off. Zora trotted back to the other sheep. She wanted to ask if Othello had really just defeated a large gray dog. It seemed to her unlikely. She met Maud grazing near George's place, so close to it that Zora had to bite back a remark in passing. Maud was chewing, lost in thought. "Maud," said Zora, "did you see how Othello fought that dog?" Maud stared blankly at her. "Othello is a sheep," she said. "Excellent grass around here," she added invitingly. Zora turned. She'd ask Maple, or better still, Mopple, if any sheep could remember peculiar things, then it was Mopple the whale. When she raised her head to pick up Mopple's scent, she noticed that Othello had joined the other sheep and was grazing by. He looked just the same as usual. Zora bent her head and began grazing too. It was best for sheep to forget confusing things as quickly as possible before the world gave way beneath their hooves. Sheep are not talkative folk. That's because their mouths are often full of grass, and sometimes they have nothing but grass in their heads. But all sheep love good stories. What they like to do best is listen, marveling. For one thing, because it is easy to listen and chew at the same time. Something was missing in their lives now that George was not around to read stories aloud to them. So it sometimes happened that one sheep would tell the others a story. The storytelling sheep was very often Mopple the whale, now and then Othello, very seldom one of the ewes. The mother ewes mostly talked about their lambs, and that didn't interest the other sheep. Of course, some lambs were legendary. Richfield had been one of those in his time, but the mothers of those lambs deliberately kept their mouths shut. All the sheep were interested when Othello told a story, but they didn't really understand him. He told them about lions and tigers and giraffes, strange animals from countries where it was burning hot. There were often arguments because each sheep imagined these animals differently. Did giraffes smell like rotten fruit? Did they have bushy ears? Did they have at least a little fleece? Othello didn't usually get any further than mere descriptions, and even these were enough to give the sheep a queasy feeling around the backs of their necks. Othello never talked about humans. When Mopple told a story, it was nearly always about humans. Mopple retold the stories that George had read aloud to them. He had remembered everything, and his stories could be almost as good as when they heard them the first round. They were just shorter. At some point, Mopple would feel hungry, and that was where the story ended. The better a story it was, that is to say, the more meadows, grazing, and fodder it contained, the sooner it was over. The real excitement now wasn't always in the stories themselves, but in wondering how far they would get this time. The prospects today looked poor. Mopple was telling the fairy tale. In no other story were there so many meadows, so much grass, and so much fruit. Mopple's eyes shone as he told them about the fairy ball held every night on the frog's meadow. His eyes went moist as he told them how envious goblins pelted the fairies with apples during the festivities. He told them about the appearance in the long grass of the Goblin King, who could raise the dead from their graves and send them to haunt the living. Then something unusual happened. Mopple was interrupted. "Do you think the Goblin King really did it?" asked Cordelia hesitantly. All the sheep knew she was talking about George's death. Mopple quickly pulled up a tuft of grass. "Or Satan?" added Lane.
Nonsense, Ramsay snorted nervously. Satan would never do a thing like that.
Several of the sheep bleated in agreement. None of them thought Satan capable of such an act. Satan was an elderly donkey who sometimes grazed in the meadow next to theirs and uttered blood-curdling cries. His voice was truly dreadful, but otherwise he'd always struck them as harmless.
"I still think it was God who killed him," said Mopple with his mouth full. "Beth thought so too."
The sheep had a certain respect for Beth, because she had invested so much time and trouble in such a doubtful item as George's soul. "Why would he do a thing like that?" asked Maud. "God moves in mysterious ways," explained Cloud. The others looked at her in surprise. Cloud realized that she had said something odd. "He says so himself," she added.
"Then he's a liar."
Othello looked furious. The eyes of the youths were shining with admiration. Only Miss Maple was unimpressed. "Was it high or low tide on the night George died?" she asked suddenly. For a second they were all silent. Then Mopple and Zora bleated in unison, "High!" "Why?" asked Maud. Maple began walking up and down as she focused. If George had been thrown over the cliff, the tide would have washed him away, maybe all the way to Europe. Then no one would have known what happened to him. This way, though, it was downright impossible for him not to be found. The murderer wanted George to be found. Why? Why do you want something to be found? The sheep thought long and hard.
"Because you want to please someone?" suggested Mopple hesitantly. "Because you want to warn someone," said Othello. "Because you want to remind someone of something," said Sir Richfield.
"Exactly." Miss Maple sounded satisfied. "Now we must find out who he's pleased, who's been warned, and who's been reminded of something, and what they've been reminded of." "We can't find that out," sighed Heather. "Maybe we can," said Miss Maple. Without another word, she began to graze. For a moment all the sheep were silent, thinking with some awe of the huge task ahead of them. A lamb suddenly bleated out loud with fright and indignation. Its mother, Sarah, set up an agitated bleat of her own. She was twisting and turning as if trying to shake an insect out of her fleece. Her lamb stood beside her, looking tearful. Then something small and shaggy shot past Sarah's legs and ran off, zigzagging as it went. the halfling, the milk thief, the winter lamb. He had taken his opportunity to steal Sarah's milk while they were all busy thinking. Every sheep knows that a winter lamb bodes no good to the flock. Winter lambs are born at the wrong season in the cold, with twisted characters and nasty souls, bringers of bad luck who can tempt robbers to roam around freezing flocks of sheep at the lean time of year. And there had never been a worse winter lamb than the one who had plagued their flocks since last year. He had been born at the darkest hour of the night. His mother had died, and they'd expected him to die too. But he tottered after the flock, squealing, and the sheep reluctantly made way for him. This went on for 2 days. On the third day, they had expected him to die at last, but George foiled them with a bottle of milk. When they bleated reproachfully at him, he muttered something about "brave little thing," and against all the dictates of reason he reared the lamb, a ruthless milk thief, as badly out of proportion as a goat, far too small for a lamb of his age, but tough and cunning. They tried to ignore him as far as they could. So there wasn't much agitation among the sheep now. Once they were sure that the winter lamb really had run off to the edge of the meadow and was hanging around under the crow's tree, they acted as if nothing had happened. They spent the rest of the day grazing, but not on George's place, and digesting the grass comfortably in the evening twilight. Then they trotted off to the hay barn. Cloud had announced that it was going to be a rainy night. They pressed close together, lambs in the middle, older sheep around them, full-grown rams on the outside, and went to sleep at once. Miss Maple dreamed a dark dream, a dream in which you could hardly see the grass in front of your own sheepy nose. The dolmen stood before her, bigger but flatter than it was in real life. 3 shadowy human figures were standing on it. Maple felt their eyes resting on her. These humans could see in the dark. Suddenly, one of them moved towards Maple. His vague outline took on the shape of the butcher. Maple turned and fled. The spade that seemed to have been holding in one front hoof fell to the ground with a dull thud. She heard the butcher's voice behind her.
"A flock needs a shepherd,"
he whispered. Maple knew at this point that she didn't need a shepherd. It was a flock she needed. She bleated until the other sheep answered from the darkness. Stumbling forward, she found the flock and pushed her way into the safe, woolly tangle. Something made her suspicious. Her flock smelled wrong. Just why, Maple couldn't say. She heard the butcher coming closer and froze. Then a wind rose and blew away the darkness like mist. In the pale light, Miss Maple could see that all the sheep in her flock had turned black. She was the only white sheep among them. The butcher was making straight for her, holding an apple pie. Suddenly it was dark around her again. Miss Maple had woken up. She was about to snuggle up to Cloud, her favorite nighttime neighbor, but something was still wrong. The sheep round her smelled like her own flock, and yet they didn't. She could pick up the scent. Mopple, who still smelled slightly of lettuce, Zora with her scent of fresh sea air, Othello's resinous ram smell, but it was as if other sheep had been mingling with them, incompatible sheep that didn't give anything away about their personalities. Half sheep, as it were. Miss Maple peered around, but it was at least as dark in the hay barn as in her dream. The rain was pouring down outside, and there were no other sounds. Maple suddenly felt sure that she had seen a movement close to the barn door. She pushed Cloud aside. Cloud began bleating quietly in her sleep. Another sheep joined in, making Miss Maple temporarily lose her sense of direction. She stood still. After a few moments, the bleating died away, and she heard the rain again. Outside, rain like stair rods was falling into the night. Maple sank up to her knees in mud. Her fleece soaked up the water, and she felt twice as heavy as usual. She thought of the lamb who had seen a ghost, and was going to make her way to the dolmen when she heard a sharp ringing sound, like stone knocking on stone. It came from the cliffs. Maple sighed. The cliffs were certainly not the place she wanted to meet a wolf's ghost on a pitch-dark, rainy night. All the same, she moved on. It was not as dark as she had feared on top of the cliffs. The sea reflected a little light, and you could see the coastline, shadowy but unmistakable. You could also see that there wasn't anyone there. Whoever had made the noise must have fallen off the cliffs. Maple felt her way cautiously up to the edge of the slippery slope with her wet hooves and peered down. Of course, she couldn't see anything, not even how far down the abyss went. She decided to retreat and realized that it wasn't going to be easy. The grass was wet and slithery. Someone had set a trap for her, and she, Miss Maple, the cleverest sheep in Glenkill, and perhaps the world, had walked right into it. Maple waited for a hand or noose to give a gentle but determined push and send her over the edge. She waited a long time. When she realized that there was no one behind her, she lost her temper. With a furious backwards jump, she made it to reasonably firm ground again and trotted back to the hay barn. She stopped at the door and took a deep breath of air. It smelled of her flock and nothing else. Maple puffed and panted with relief and noticed that her legs were trembling. She searched for Cloud, who was still bleating softly somewhere, lost in a dream where there was no butcher and no apple pie, probably just a large green field of clover. Suddenly, one of her still shaking hooves trod in something warm and liquid. The liquid was dripping off Sir Richfield. The old ram was standing there motionless, with his eyes closed, as if he were fast asleep. He was soaking wet, like a sheep who had been dipped under water for a very long time. Miss Maple laid her head in Cloud's woolly back and thought.